From New York Times Opinion, this is The Ezra Klein Show. I think a lot of Democrats, and even a lot of Republicans, are still a bit agog that Donald Trump is going to be the Republican nominee once again in 2024. After everything he said and done, after what he did during COVID, after everything he did to try and overturn the 2020 election, amidst all the criminal trials and scandals and corruption, all the people he has betrayed and insulted and double-crossed, this guy, still. It's not like there weren't alternatives. DeSantis pitched himself as Donald Trump without the wild personality. Maybe what people liked about Trump were the positions, but he was being held back by who he was. At least not on the Republican side. That did not turn out to be the problem for Donald Trump. Vivek Ramaswamy was a younger, more cheerful, more multicultural spin on the Trumpist theme. Neither of them found any real footing. Both of them were missing something. And I think trying to think about what they were missing is important, because there is this endless dialogue about what is the nature of Trump's appeal. And people keep trying to split him into component parts. The policy, the showman, the vibes, the media. It can make Trump seem a little too unique. You sometimes hear people describe his connection with his base in quasi-mystical terms. But I think that's a mistake. I don't think Trump is that unique. And what is interesting to me about him in part is that he puts together a bunch of traits that occur and recur in politicians like him across places and times. You keep having this archetype of the right-wing populist showman, the grinning ethnonationalist strongman. You see figures like him in other countries. Bolsonaro in Brazil is a lot like Trump. Berlusconi in Italy had a lot of consonances with Trump. Boris Johnson in the UK. But you've also seen a lineage of figures like him in our country. We have a tendency to narrativize politics and campaigns around candidates, around what politicians are offering. We have more trouble talking about what it is that voters want. One way of thinking about this is we're better talking about supply in politics than about demand. But there has long been demand for a right-wing populist showman in the United States. The demand has been at times unmet. It has been at times suppressed. These people were not given a candidate to vote for in a two-party system. But it never went away. Perhaps it will never go away. John Gans is the author of the excellent Substack newsletter Unpopular Front. In June, he's publishing When the Clock Broke, Con Men, Conspiracists, and How America Cracked Up in the Early 1990s. You can pre-order that now. And he tells this fascinating shadow story of the 1990s. I mean, we think now about this much more consensus-oriented politics, Bill Clinton, sex scandals, but it's this time of peace and prosperity. But if you look closely, if you look at the edges, particularly the edges of the Republican Party, something else was pulsing in our politics, growing, gaining strength. You look at David Duke. You look at Pat Buchanan. These politicians who even then were rising to meet it. And so it is worth looking closely at them, what they tried to do, the kind of response they got, and at Trump, who was watching them closely, who, as you'll hear, was very aware of their efforts, who really learned something. As always, my email, the show's email, for feedback, for guest suggestions, for thoughts, EzraKleinShow@nytimes.com. John Gans, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So your book and your work on the 90s begins with David Duke.
Right.
So who is he, and why is he your launching point?
Well, David Duke was a Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. He was a neo-Nazi. And despite his sordid past, he did quite well, especially among white voters. He ran explicitly against the leadership of the Republican Party and beat them. So Reagan, who was immensely popular in Louisiana among Republicans, among everybody in Louisiana, ran radio ads against him. The entire RNC kind of went to war against him. There was a huge concerted effort by Republicans and by really much the entire political establishment to stop him. And he said, these people are outsiders, telling you people how to vote. I am a populist. I represent the forgotten white man, and this political establishment doesn't really understand you anymore. And he was able, that message resonated with people. And the concerted attack of the Republican establishment on him failed. And this excited a lot of people. And then he was a candidate for the governorship of Louisiana and gave the political establishment quite a scare in late 1991.
So what then was Duke's platform? I mean, when you look at the issues and his message, what was he really running on?
Duke's message, strangely enough, was not all that different from conservative Republicans at the time. He was against welfare. He was concerned about crime. He was against affirmative action. He was a little bit more explicit about the racial subtext it was for other Republicans. For him, it was more text. And his crowds plainly understood that and were very excited by it.
But it seems like it was text for him in an interesting way, that he gets at something that becomes very important, I think, in Republican Party politics right around then and very much now is important, which is that you, the white Christian people, are now the embattled minority.
Yes.
And there was a moment in the debate in that governor's race where he's asked if he repudiates his neo-Nazi past, and you can hear him make that turn.
As a newfound Christian, a born again, are you here willing now to apologize to the people, the minorities of this state whom you have so dastardly insulted, sir?
Mr. Duke, you have 30 seconds. 30 seconds? Of course I apologize for things that I've said that have been intolerant and improper.
Do you repudiate the Klan
and I do
and the
repudiate
neo-Nazi?
The Klan or any other racist organization or intolerant organization that exists in this state or this country? I think we've all got to work together. But you don't make up for past discrimination by putting new discrimination on people with these affirmative action programs and policies. And there's a lot of racism that exists in all communities, not just the white community.
And then here's another clip of Duke at a rally the following year. This is now when he's running for president.
You know, the government would not tolerate an all-white scholarship program. You know, we can have a Miss Black America, can't we? But you try having a Miss White America in this country and see what they hire. You know, the problem, ladies and gentlemen, is not my background. The problem they find with David Duke is that I say things nobody else will say in American politics, things that must be said.
One thing I think you hear there is an essential quality of slipperiness to these guys. There's always this question of on what level are they talking? What is the message that they are saying explicitly? And what is the message that they are communicating to the people who know that the thing they really believe is the thing you're not really allowed to say? And I feel like they have different strategies for this. With Duke, strangely, I think it took a form of almost gentility. He could rely on his neo-Nazi past, his Ku Klux Klan past, to send one message, and then he would be there telling you, I'm not a racist, I just care about equality. With some other figures, more modern figures maybe, it takes the form of this edgelord humor. Oh, I'm just joking, you're just humorless. But there is so often among these right-wing populists this shimmering quality of meaning. Are they saying it or are they not saying it? And I'm curious why you think that recurs so often.
Yes, there's a certain slipperiness to him for sure, because he lied an enormous amount. I think a part of it is being a little naughty and obscene and walking right up to the line and kind of sometimes going beyond it. And I think that that's a huge part of it, which is just like, these people are stopping your enjoyment. They're somehow preventing you from living the life, saying the things that you really want to say and would make you feel good. The kind of winking or shimmering you're talking about, where there's a certain excitement in the fact that he represents something unacceptable and represents something that's frightening and disconcerting to the people that his constituents want to frighten and disconcert. Politics is about, you know, when you want to get certain things done, you need the ideas to be out there, so you have to push them out into the open somehow. Some of it's just political rhetoric, you know, which is just saying stuff.
I want to pick up on that word excitement. Yeah. There is a kind of electric quality to being part of one of these insurgency campaigns.
Yeah.
And particularly when you're dealing with these populists, you have this sort of giant middle finger energy of these campaigns. It's like you're telling off the liberal establishment, you're telling off the media establishment, you're telling off the Republican establishment.
And there's a clip I want to play here of Duke at that 1992 rally, which captures some of that energy in language that sounds very familiar right now.
And if we don't watch out for our country, first and foremost, we will lose our nation. You know, the only people who are really pushing for this new world order, who are they really? A few of the trilateralists, a few of the CFR people, a few of the international conglomerates, international financial concerns. They have no allegiance to America. They have a worldwide network of money. All they care about is their bottom line. Well, I don't want a part of a new world order where Americans lose their sovereignty and their rights and their freedoms, and that's where we're going. I say it's time to put America first in this world.
What is that kind of latent energy, that energy that's not left-right, but just a middle finger to sort of the entirety of the power structure?
I think basically one of the biggest energies or features of American politics that, as you said, is not left, right, or center, and it's not particularly ideological, is a sense among a lot of people of being extremely alienated from the political establishment, feeling that their representatives don't, in fact, represent them, and that the political establishment, the media, universities are corrupt. As liberals, we might respond and say, well, they're not really corrupt because we can point to statistics. In America, there's not really much corruption. The word corruption implies something broader than just breaking the law. It's a sense that they're self-dealing, that they don't have the interests of their constituents that they should have at heart, and that they, are unresponsive.
And isn't there something to that feeling?
Yeah, unfortunately there is. I think that there is a little bit of a crisis in this country that as we get bigger, as the country gets more complicated, these institutions are not particularly responsive to people, particularly people who are not educated. They are not controlled by them. They don't necessarily respond to their concerns and interests, sometimes for good reason. But yes, there is, a sense among people that these institutions are alien, and that's true.
Well, when you say we're going through a crisis around this, I do question that a little bit.
Okay.
And I question it in this way, that is there ever a time when the dynamic being described here is not true? So the political scientist Larry Bartels distinguishes between this idea of populist waves and populist reservoirs. That often when one of these guys wins, you're like, well, there's a big populist wave sweeping the world. But there's also a way of looking at this, that it's a reservoir. This feeling is always there. There are always insiders and outsiders, always elites and people who are not the elite, always institutions that you can't penetrate, always a rural-urban divide. Yeah. And things happen at different moments, often around changes in media structures and communication structures that make it harder for elites to suppress that dynamic, right? Makes it harder for the reservoir to get tapped.
Yeah.
But that it's always there, and it's a reason. I mean, we're starting in the 90s here, the 80s, I guess, with Duke.
Right.
But you could go backwards. I mean, you go to George Wallace, you could talk about Huey Long, you can look in other countries, you can look at Mussolini. I think sometimes there's a tendency to be very present-focused about it.
Oh, for sure. I think that's a fair point, and I think that the idea of a reservoir is interesting. Obviously, populism is even before the literal populist movement as a style has a very long history in American politics. It's a perennial part of American politics. I do believe under certain conditions, people's perception of the political establishment's lack of response to their concerns, which can be not necessarily appear rational, becomes more intense. You see this in the early 90s when the sort of deleterious effects of Reaganomics become clear, and a lot of people's lives are affected negatively by the changes in the economy. The Cold War breaks down, and that has both an economic aspect and an ideological aspect because its orientation point for American politics goes away. And I think that there's a sense among some of the people that I research and talk about that we've done the work of ending the Soviet Union. Now it's time to get the commies at home. So yeah, I think there is a constant hum, and there are also people who would just kind of have these politics more ideologically and are always trying to create a movement. But I think that under certain conditions, that comes to the surface more than others.
So in the end, what happens to the Duke campaign in Louisiana?
Duke loses by a pretty big margin. There's a big concerted effort. The business community turns against him. They said, look, this guy becomes governor. Economically, we're going to be in tough shape because no one's going to want to do business with us. A huge black vote came out to knock him out. But what people noticed and was remarkable, and maybe his goal in a way, was that he got 55% of the white vote in Louisiana, which was pretty remarkable. I mean, There are deeper roots of racist politics in the South, of course, but it was pretty remarkable at that late date for a lot of people that this neo-Nazi won 55% of the white vote.
So after Duke loses this libertarian figure, Murray Rothbard, writes an essay called Right-Wing Populism that takes as its launching point Duke's loss.
Yeah.
And it's very fascinating to read today and very important to your story. So can you explain who Rothbard was and what you found significant in the essay?
So Murray Rothbard, for most of his career, was a little bit of a fringe figure on the right. He's a libertarian. He's an extreme free marketer. He was almost an isolationist. He was too much of a free marketer for the National Review set. They made fun of him wanting to privatize lighthouses. He never forgot that. He was opposed to military spending because he believed it built up the welfare warfare state. He was a little bit homeless politically for a lot of his life, and he associated himself with the old right, the pre-war right of Lindbergh, isolationism, America first. He thought this was the true tradition. And he saw in Duke a kind of return of that and a way to unseat the conservative and Republican establishment that had sort of shunted him to the side.
So I had not read the essay until you drew my attention to it. And as I read it, two things about it struck me as important. And the first is this structural argument it makes. Rothbard says right at the beginning that David Duke is only defeated by, quote, a massive campaign of hysteria, of fear and hate, orchestrated by all wings of the ruling elite, from official right to left. And he goes on to say that, quote, the basic right-wing populist insight is that we live in a statist country and a statist world dominated by a ruling elite consisting of a coalition of big government, big business, and various influential special interest groups. So tell me about that basic right-wing populist insight.
Well, I think that right-wing populist insight maps very closely onto the feeling. I mean, it's more ideological, but it maps very easily onto the sentiment that we talked about earlier about a sense of alienation from the political establishment. It's not trying to necessarily go for small government anymore, as traditional conservatives wanted to do, but rather grab the reins of power and smash up the things that we don't like.
This always feels to me like the thing that separates various kinds of populisms, but particularly right-wing populism in this case, which is the fact that the Republican Party is the enemy.
Yeah.
At least the Republican Party before you take it over. Sometimes after you take it over, too.
Yeah.
But this also makes it very hard to govern in coalition with the Republican Party. I mean, I think you see this in the way that more right-wing populist House Republicans keep deposing Republican speakers. You are at war with what you might otherwise understand as your own political home.
Absolutely. I think that that's a contradiction that's sort of hard to square and makes populism hard. It's an effective political strategy or rhetoric, but as a system of government sometimes obviously has problems. But yeah, the idea of Rothbard and the people around him was that they needed to attack and take over the Republican Party. Obviously, in 2015-16, Trump's candidacy was the realization of this, which was an attack on the Republican establishment from a figure outside. You know, he's not part of the leadership of the Republican Party. He very explicitly comes as an outsider and says, these people are idiots. They don't know what they're doing. They've been constantly selling you out. And he immediately electrifies Republicans.
So is Rothbard in this essay, in this moment, trying to create something new, this new thing of right-wing populism? Or does he understand himself as describing something old?
I think he understands himself as describing something old. So in this essay, one of the big inspirations for the strategy that he's devising or articulating here is Joe McCarthy. So many conservatives and centrist liberals or right-leaning liberals looked at McCarthy and said, well, we don't like communism, and we're worried about this, and we're Cold Warriors, but he's so crude, he's so demagogic. If it was only put nicer, and Rothbard says, no, you don't get it. The form, the means that he used, this populist attack on the establishment, exactly the point. That's what was effective about it. He scared the living shit out of them, and that's what I like about it. And it was exciting and fun for people. And he talks about something called And I think that this is really interesting to think about in terms of Trump. He came up with this in a memo when he was in the 1950s when he was working for a right-wing think tank. He called it a populist short circuit. A short circuit. The memo was called In Defense of Demagogues. We need this demagogue figure to go around the mediating institutions and plug directly into the population that feels this sense of alienation and go straight to them and get them excited and rouse them. And I think that, obviously Trump resonates with that a lot.
Yeah, I mean, this is the other piece of the Rothbard essay that I'm interested in. Mm-hmm. This idea that the form and the content are fused.
Yes.
He says you need somebody who can, quote, go over the heads of the media and political elites to reach the working class directly, and that requires, quote, this inspiring and charismatic political leadership.
Yeah.
One of the motivations for this conversation for me is I've been interested for a while about why when you see these figures in different eras and in different countries, is the personality so often similar? We'll talk about Buchanan, but Trump, you think about Berlusconi in Italy, you think about Bolsonaro in Brazil. I can kind of keep going down a list of these people. They often come out of media. Mussolini, of course, comes out of the media. And there's often this like Barnum and Bailey quality to them. They're outrageous, they're showmen. And one sort of popular argument among liberals is that these things actually do not need to be connected. So my friend Matt Iglesias at Substack had this argument about Trump a few weeks ago where he says, look, the thing about Trump is that he was moderating on Medicare, on Social Security, in a way you could add into that the Iraq War, but he was moving to the right on immigration. And this is actually a sort of popular way to shift the valence, the ideological valence of the Republican Party. And it's just his sort of vile, crazy persona that kept that from being overwhelmingly effective. And maybe that's true, right? If you could push somebody like that through the primary and just put them up, like Mitt Romney with a different position on Medicare, maybe he wins the election. I don't know. But the fact that you always have this combination of characteristics connected to each other makes me believe there's something about them that need each other. And Rothbard here sort of offers one answer to it, at least, which is that if you are going to be doing the populist thing, you can't rely on any institutional support. And so you need someone who is so electric from a mass media perspective that it sort of overwhelms the system's defenses and creates a sort of direct connection to the voter.
Yeah. I think that there is no separating form and content, as you said, that the figure has to represent the middle finger in order to be effective and get the constituency behind them. I think that Matt is right in the sense that that creates weaknesses too. It builds a constituency. It alienates a lot of other people who might otherwise be amenable to those sorts of things. But I don't think it works without the theatrical, outrageous parts of it. And I think that that is part of the reason why people gravitate towards it. I think you could speak to people and they may not have very clear ideas about any given policy issue. And yet what they do believe is that the political establishment sucks and they like somebody who tells them to fuck off.
Yeah, I mean, political scientists will tell you, I mean, this is an old finding, that the percentage of voters who have what they call an ideological relationship to politics, it's a fraction.
Precisely.
Like, it's like
Precisely.
Nobody.
Precisely.
And there is this demand for a populist right figure.
Yeah.
In American politics, in other countries' politics, it recurs across time and place. I think it's very important to understand that demand is maybe going up and down, but always there at some level.
Right.
Even when it is not being met.
Yeah.
But the thing that certainly in America, the Republican Party is always trying to do is control that demand, harness its energy, harness its votes,
right?
But for what it wants to do, right? For, Murray Rothbard's libertarian agenda, for Paul Ryan saying the Tea Party is really an effort, what it really wants is to privatize Medicare.
Right.
In a way, Donald Trump, I think, understands that energy really well because he understands that it does want things, right? I think specifically it does want things around immigration and national character. Sure. But when I look at populist right voters, they don't want Medicare gone.
No.
They don't want Social Security gone.
No.
They maybe want it just to be for them.
Right.
The form does seem as or more important than the content. And in fact, the content seems very malleable. And one of Trump's signal characteristics as a political figure is the malleability of his content, how much it will change even rally to rally or even within a single rally. But the energy is actually about this sort of middle finger politics is, I think, a much more honest sense of it than where the Republican Party has often been, and why the Republican Party keeps getting overwhelmed by it, because they want to harness it to a policy agenda that it does not share and often does not even care about.
No, and it's even sometimes opposed to. And that goes back to Duke's campaign, because he ran against the kind of conservative Democrat turned Republican who was very austerity focused. This is what Trump realizes, unconsciously or consciously. There's not a big constituency for some of the things that Republicans are really interested in, like cutting Medicare and stuff like that, even and increasingly interventionism abroad and stuff like that. And then there's a much broader constituency of people who have right-wing instincts but don't have very particular views about those issues. So yeah, I completely agree with what you're saying.
So I want to move here to Pat Buchanan,
Sure.
who I think of as the truest forerunner to Donald Trump.
Yeah.
For people who don't know him, who is he and how does he enter this story for you?
Pat Buchanan is and was, I suppose, one of the most prominent conservatives in America. He was a protege in a way of William Buckley. He was part of the early conservative movement. He differed from conservatives in that he went to work in the Nixon administration, which was, viewed by conservatives as being centrist, pragmatic, not ideological enough. But Buchanan saw something in Nixon, the figure, that he had this sort of populist energy. He represented forgotten Americans. So Nixon's presidency had a very big symbolic importance for Buchanan. And he viewed Watergate as a kind of coup by the establishment against this kind of salt of the earth, middle American populism that Nixon represented. He worked in the Reagan administration as communications director. And he said after that experience, the biggest vacuum in American politics is to the right of Ronald Reagan. And he sort of was on a mission to push American politics to the right.
I've been trying to decide what order to go on with Buchanan because there's so much to say about him.
Sure.
He's actually so overdue for a huge biography.
Yeah.
But maybe start here. What is his relationship in the story to David Duke?
Well, Pat Buchanan was among a number of people on the right who looked at David Duke's candidacy and found it very interesting and saw something hopeful there, as if it was an indication that their time had come.
What's the evidence of that?
The evidence of that is that he wrote it. He said, basically, Republicans ought to look at David Duke is doing and kind of appropriate some of his program, like we did with George Wallace. And he also saw David Duke's candidacy as the point at which, his own candidacy for president might make sense. David Duke started to get a lot of attention outside of Louisiana as well. He looked as if, there was some sort of interest in the rest of the country. And Buchanan looked at this, being a seasoned political insider who had spent so much time in Washington and said, there's something going on. I'm going to try to ride this wave as well.
David Duke actually boasted about that, right? We have a clip of him from this same 1992 rally we played earlier saying, look at the effect I'm having. Look at Pat Buchanan.
I noticed that more and more of my issues are now becoming the issues of other candidates. And I really like Patrick Buchanan, but I know where he got his ideas to run for politics using my issues. I know where they came from. He did a column about 4 years ago after I ran for the House of Representatives in Louisiana, and he said that David Duke was showing the Republican Party the way.
And then it's weird. On the other side, you have Buchanan then saying that David Duke was really the one copying him.
Well, he says both. Pat Buchanan at one point says, we ought to copy David Duke. And then when they try to connect David Duke to Pat Buchanan goes on TV and he says, no, he's been copying me. I think he's been reading my old columns. I mean, I think that they mirrored each other in a lot of different ways, but I would say that he looked at Duke as a signal of when to sort of launch his campaign for sure.
I want to give people a sense for what this felt and sounded like.
Yeah.
I have a few clips here, but
Sure.
let's play the first one from Buchanan's 1992 campaign announcement.
So today we call for a new patriotism, where Americans begin to put the needs of Americans first. For a new nationalism, where in every negotiation Be it arms control or trade, the American side seeks advantage and victory for the United States. And the people of this country need to recapture our capital city of Washington from lobbyists and registered agents of foreign powers who are hired to look out for everybody and everything except the national interest of the United States.
I mean, that sounds pretty damn familiar right now. So when you're talking about who might sue whom for copyright infringement.
Yes.
But you may have this, well, was Donald Trump paying attention to any of this? So there's this other clip I want to show you here, which we found. This is also from the 92 election. And I find it completely astonishing. It's like a Rosetta Stone to this whole era. So this is Donald Trump on Larry King talking about the possibility of Buchanan running and talking about David Duke.
There's a tremendous amount of hostility in the United States.
Anger.
It's anger. I mean, that's an anger vote. People are angry about what's happened. People are angry about the jobs. If David Duke runs, David Duke is going to get a lot of votes. Whether that be good or bad, David Duke is going to get a lot of votes. Pat Buchanan, who really has many of the same theories, except it's in a better package. Pat Buchanan is going to take a lot of votes away from George Bush. So if you have these two guys running, or even one of them running, I think George Bush could be in big trouble.
I mean, this is over 30 years ago, and Trump sees it. He sees it all really clearly. And he even understands this sort of lineage happening. He's almost complimentary about Buchanan as this better package of this thing that he understands to be politically potent, but maybe a little bit too far for the American people.
Trump recently mentioned Pat Buchanan, and he said, great guy, conservative guy, great guy. And Buchanan said, Trump is the last shot for my ideas, or these kinds of ideas. Yeah, I think that he's a precursor to Trump in many, many ways. Buchanan, although there is I hope I can say this, there's a thuggish side to him. He is an educated man and articulate. He quotes poetry in his speeches. And in fact, some of his allies on the populist right kind of thought he was too much of a highbrow still. And that sort of contributed to the fact that he didn't really take root. And also still too in love with the Republican Party, which had been his home, and still too in love with the conservative movement that had been his home.
But Buchanan is interesting, too, because he's a border crosser.
Yeah.
So Buchanan is a genuine extremist, I think it is fair to say. I mean, William F. Buckley, the editor of National Review, at some point does this huge, long essay trying to decide if Pat Buchanan is an anti-Semite. So there's that. But at the same time, Buchanan, while he's a strange conservative revanchist, he's also kind of a media darling. He's like the in-house paleo-conservative, true conservative of the McLaughlin Group back then. He eventually becomes the host of Crossfire when that show launches, the conservative side of the initial Crossfire.
Yeah.
He becomes the in-house conservative later on MSNBC.
Sure.
Joining us now is my MSNBC political colleague, Pat Buchanan. Pat, it's been far too long since you've been on the show. It's really nice to see you.
Good to see you.
When Rachel Maddow's show launches, there is a segment called It's Pat, where she argues with Pat Buchanan like he's her racist uncle who she views with affection.
Pat, I think that by advocating that the Republican Party try to stir up racial animus among white voters here, you're really dating yourself. You're dating yourself.
I think they ought to defend the legitimate rights of white working class folks who are the victims of discrimination, because that's the right thing to do.
Buchanan understood something about the media the others didn't, about the ability to use the fact that it didn't like people like him, but somehow needed people like him at the same time.
Pat Buchanan, MSNBC political analyst, I'm very sorry that we're out of time. It's nice to have you back on the show, Pat. Thanks.
I've enjoyed it, and as I always do, Rachel.
We will be right back.
Yes, that's right. He was very good at being the House conservative on TV shows, but was extreme, as you mentioned. But also, people did like him. He was very friendly and polite and nice, and all of his hosts that he worked with, all the liberals that he worked with, they said, oh, he's such a wonderful man. I mean, throughout his career, basically, evinces very anti-Semitic ideas. And a lot of his Jewish colleagues said, oh, he would never. He's such a darling. He's always been so nice to me. So I think he could use a lot of charm. Politicians need to be able to do this and turn on the charm when he needed to and make people feel like he wasn't so scary, which I think Trump does in a different way. So I think he was really very canny. This is the era of the emergence of cable news. And he just knew how to do that so well, to be on a panel show, to be on a talk show, to give great sound bites. Again, he's a little bit more articulate in a way than Trump, but yes, his use of the media is quite impressive.
And this goes a little bit to the Rothbard thing of recognizing that you need somebody who can, in a way, go around the institutions. But I think it gets at the way the Rothbard thing was wrong. And something that Buchanan understands and that Trump later really understands.
Right.
Which is that you don't need to get around the institutions. You need to go through the institutions.
Yeah.
That there's actually a kind of way you can exploit them.
Yes.
If you are sufficiently outrageous, if you are good copy. I mean, there's a famous Les Moonves quote where he's the head of CBS, and he says, Donald Trump may not be good for the nation.
Right.
But pretty good for CBS.
Yeah.
And Buchanan has this quality a little bit, too, where on the one hand, you read the thing he's saying, and these are the very institutions that are destroying the entire country.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, he's a member in good standing of all of them, collecting a paycheck from all of them.
Right.
And this ability to be in and out of it at the same time.
Right.
And Trump understood and still understands a kind of essential... There does not need to be a affection for there to be a unity of interest.
Oh, absolutely. I think that back when Rothbard wrote that essay, he was talking about newspapers, and he thought already, he talks about how McCarthy was using TV. I think it's different forms of media are more amenable to this quote unquote short circuit because they're not, they have less editorial control essentially.
And they're based on ratings and competition.
Ratings and competition. They build on the need for, commercial advantage, and that's based on showmanship and theatricality, something that Trump is obviously amazing at, and Buchanan had some very good skill at. But he was a news guy. He wasn't as funny. He wasn't as outrageous. Trump is an entertainer. Television news is entertainment, but it's entertainment for the types of people who watch TV news. There are types of people who don't watch the news. And I think Trump is entertaining for people who don't watch the news as well. Yeah.
I want to talk, too, about Buchanan's ideological content. So I don't remember if I read this book when Trump was running in 2016 or after he won. But I went back and read this book Buchanan published in 2002 called The Death of the West. So I want to read you a couple of quotes from it that I highlighted. So here's one. Buchanan writes, in 1960, only 16 million Americans did not trace their ancestors to Europe. Today, the number is 80 million. No nation has ever undergone so rapid and radical a transformation. He then goes global in the analysis, writing, quote, in 1960, people of European ancestry were 1/4 of the world's population. In 2000, they were 1/6. In 2050, they will be 1/10. These are the statistics of a vanishing race. So this is publishing in 2002.
Right.
George W. Bush is president. But this is not the conservatism of George W. Bush. This is not exactly a policy agenda, but it is worried about something much more fundamental.
Yeah. Buchanan, as most of these people that we've discussed, have a racial consciousness. What they're worried about is demographic decline of white people, both economically and in sheer numbers. They believe that the core of American civilization is people of white European descent. And the country is no longer America if those are not the dominant people in the country. I mean, David Duke was a neo-Nazi. So the racism is at the very core of how he thinks. So I think that there's no escaping it. And Buchanan, obviously, I'll just flat out say it, is a racist and anti-Semite. It's difficult to argue otherwise at this point. I think a lot of times when I get into arguments about how extreme Trump is or what his politics are, I always go back to, I'm like, well, who got excited about it? Who immediately, when he appeared on the scene, their ears perked up? And it was a lot of people from previously quite marginalized streams of politics, white supremacists, neo-Nazis, etc. I mean, Buchanan is in that world a little bit, or a lot of it. And they say, finally, this is our breakthrough. Finally, someone's talking like us and is speaking to our concerns. Trump's appearance in the political scene was a rapturous event for them, a breakthrough.
I want to get another thing Buchanan is good at doing here, because he connects that sort of blood and soil ethnic nationalism.
Sure.
Then to this other thing that is happening and is a very powerful and much more, I think, ideologically normalized sense, which is just the sense of disorientation about how society is changing. So he writes here again in this Death of the West book Millions have begun to feel like strangers in their own land.
Mm-hmm.
They recoil from a popular culture that is saturated with raw sex and trumpets hedonistic values. They see old holidays disappear and old heroes degraded. They see the art and artifacts of a glorious past removed from their museums and replaced by the depressing, the ugly, the abstract, the anti-American.
Mm-hmm.
They watch as books they cherished disappear from the schools they attended to be replaced by authors and titles that they've never heard of. The moral code that they were raised to live by has been overthrown. The culture they grew up with is dying inside the country they grew up in.
Yeah.
And that just feels, that just is the things people are writing now about
absolutely.
wokeness, about DEI, about changes in the schools, just written in 2002 in a slightly different context.
Absolutely. It's the same message. The difference is that now a lot of conservatives would not have associated themselves with Buchanan's brand, right? And Trump has been this breakthrough, and now pretty much every right-winger in good standing says similar sorts of things.
I want to get at why this ripens.
Yeah.
So Duke fails and fails badly. Buchanan also fails. He runs in 1992. He does not win. George H.W. Bush is a nominee. He runs in 1996. He does not win.
No.
And he kind of settles into senescence, as I mentioned before, as not even the big conservative on Fox News.
No.
He's a conservative at MSNBC.
Right.
Right? Like, I used to go on Morning Joe with that guy.
Right.
Like, that actually happened in my life. It's weird. And it doesn't work for him.
No.
Why does Trump succeed where these figures fail?
Partially, it's his style as a showman and his skills that he got from that. I think Trump, I like to say he's a synthesis, right? He's a synthesis of different aspects of American politics and culture, one of which is obviously the entertainment industry. He comes from the world of tabloids. He comes from the world of reality TV show. This is where a lot of people know him from, and this is where he gets his showmanship. I think it's that he was more unambiguously an attack on the establishment and couldn't be said, oh, this guy's been hanging around with these people for a very long time. He's been hanging around with rich people in this country for a very long time. But he was unambiguously an attack on the establishment. He also was no holds barred in his rhetoric, and it really excited people. His speeches, his way of talking was fun. The way that Rothbard talks about this, he says it's got to be rousing, energetic, charismatic. I think the sheer charisma that he had was part of it. His New York accent conveys a kind of folksy but highly intelligent, cunning thing to people. And he sounds like he knows what he's talking about. He is a little bit of a gangster. So I think the archetype of gangsters from movies, which as being, they're bad, but they're good. They're kind of fun. They know how to get things done. There's no bullshit with them. We have this very affectionate almost picture of gangsters in American culture, and he's a gangster in a certain way. He's a little bit of a mobster. Buchanan doesn't sound like that. He sounds pretty square. So I think that that's a huge part of it. And he comes from this kind of semi-legitimate family business where it provides for people, it does kind of corrupt things and cuts corners. I think that actually really appeals to people.
You've written that, quote, the social character of Trumpism is crucial to understanding him.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
It's strange to think about this, but I think Trump is a family values candidate. And I think that a lot of liberals will look at him and say, well, he's such a horrible father, and he's got all these divorces, all these children. Yeah, and how could they be so hypocritical? They used to talk about family values, well, now look at Trump. Trump's family looks like a lot of American families. There's divorces. There's lots of extra kids. He might not like his ex-wife very much. He might not even really like the kids that much. And he still is able somehow to provide for them and look like a big, strong guy. I think that he represents a kind of family values that are in some ways new because of the change of the family structure, because of divorce, and because of, in some ways, very old and patriarchal. Like he's Big Daddy. He's the head of the clan, the CLN. Yeah. So I think that appeals to a lot of Americans who want to take care of their families in the same way. Their families writ large.
There's another thing that I want to bring in here, and I always find this genuinely tricky to talk about among liberals.
Yeah.
David Duke, not a fun guy.
No.
You don't want David Duke at a party.
No.
Pat Buchanan, not a fun guy.
Not really.
I don't think you'd want Pat Buchanan at a party. I've met him. He's fine, but well, maybe not from my perspective.
Where you're going.
But
yeah,
I think it is very hard for liberals to admit that within Trumpism, there is a joyousness.
Oh, there's absolutely an enormous amount of enjoyment in it. It's an enormous amount of fun. People follow him on the road.
You got merch, right? You got these fun hats.
It's like, I mean, another thing that's been brought up intelligently about Trump is professional wrestling. You know,
yes.
I think that, it's an enormous amount of fun to go to those rallies for a lot of people. And he is funny. Let's face it. I remember I had, Thanksgiving with my family, all very nice upper middle class liberals. And I said Trump was funny. Oh, no, he's not funny. He's not funny. Like, I don't think he's funny. Come on. Give me a break. He can be very funny.
Let me pick up on that, though, because I do think this gets to something real and something Trump picks up on well, that Buchanan picks up on well. I used to think about the efforts to create a Fox News of the left.
Yeah.
And it never took, ever.
No.
Because liberals did not want a thing that felt like Fox News. What took was Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert and Rachel Maddow. When you think about the comedy on the right and the comedy on the left, when you think about the attacks on the right and the attacks on the left, as you were saying, the attack on the right is that you're not a real American, right? That's what Bill O'Reilly was always about.
Right.
The attack on the left is you're dumb.
Right.
The left's humor is irony.
Yes.
And the right's humor is the insult comic.
Yes.
Right? Trump is fundamentally an insult comic. Like, Barack Obama actually is quite funny, but he's an ironist.
Right.
And I always talk about this sort of empathic chasm around Trump. I empathically cannot actually embody finding Trump appealing. I do not find the guy appealing. And I do think one of the things here is that it is sometimes hard for liberals to appreciate, given how horrifying many of the things Trump says happen to be, that there's a deep enjoyment to him.
Oh, sure.
If you're his audience.
Absolutely. And I have to tell you, I don't know if I should admit this to such a huge audience. I do sometimes get it because I like gangster movies. And I think that shit is funny. And I think that the way they express themselves is very appealing. There's a certain type of wise guy masculinity of Trump, which I do think is entertaining, and I wouldn't say I could identify with it, but I get the appeal for sure. I mean, it's the same reason why we like Tony Soprano and stuff like that. It's like, there's something atavistic about it. There's something stupid. It's kind of stupid, but there is a kick that's there. Yeah.
And I want to go back here to this idea of the middle finger politics, because this feels to me like the trap liberals are in with Trump.
Yeah.
That part of what makes him funny is how outraged he makes them.
Oh, for sure.
That the energy is actually unleashed in the interaction.
Yeah.
It is, I have a little kid.
Yeah.
What is the first joke little kids tell? It is some kind of complete nonsensical setup, and then the joke is poop.
Right.
The absolute joke is a little bit of shock value.
Oh, for sure.
Right? Like, can you believe I just said that? Can you believe we're saying that together?
Yeah.
At a much more kind of elevated level, a lot of the energy, it seems to me, in a Trump rally, when I watch them, is this, can you believe we're doing it together? And then the response, right?
Yeah.
If there was never a response, if my kid didn't think I would ever have a response to him saying naughty words, it wouldn't be funny.
Right.
He doesn't find the word bagel funny.
Right.
Even though it's kind of a funny word to say.
Yeah, there has to be a reaction.
There has to be a reaction. And that feels like the deep bind, that you're like kind of trapped in this interaction with it.
Well, yeah, okay. I think like Trump's insight and the insight with a lot of these people, and this might be the key populist insight, is that there's something obscene about power and you have to be able to walk up to the line and go past it. Trump is obscene. He says obscene things and people love it. I do think that this is what happens with the way populist politicians campaign, though, which makes it hard to say, oh, just don't react. They do two things. They have a very effective little tactic, which is, well, if they get reacted to, they play off that. And if they don't get reacted to, they take it a little farther and see what happens.
So that's the supply side of Donald Trump, the aesthetics of Donald Trump.
Sure.
I'm curious if you think, though, that there was a change in the reservoir, a ripening also of the issues. When you think about what Buchanan is talking about here, and elsewhere he talks a lot about this change in morals, in culture, in this idea of what equality is and what it means. He talks a lot about how the West is being made to feel that it's racist and everything that is achieved is ill-gotten.
Right.
Is something also happening as, you have Barack Obama who becomes president?
Sure.
I'm very much of the opinion there's no Donald Trump without Barack Obama.
Oh, of course.
How much is also, the thing Buchanan is a little bit early on.
Sure.
Right? The sense of white people, of Christian people beginning to feel like an embattled minority, whether or not they actually are, has matured to a point that it has become a mass politics when before it was a fractional politics.
Well, absolutely. I like to point this out. How did Trump get started in politics, right? Birtherism. What is birtherism? Obama's not really a citizen.
As you're about to see, Donald Trump is not backing away from the firestorm of controversy he ignited this week on The View when he called out the president of the United States about his birth certificate.
So there is something very strange going on. He spent a lot of money to keep this out of print. There's something very, very strange going on, a lot of legal fees. Why can't he produce a birth certificate?
You've never seen George W. Bush's birth certificate, have you?
No, I haven't, but I'm sure he has one, and I guarantee he was born here, and I hope that Barack Obama was born here.
The core of Donald Trump's entire politics from then until now is certain people, and this is why some people respond to it, is certain people are not really American citizens. What is denying the election? Certain people's votes. The election is stolen. Yeah, well, no, it's just that certain people's votes don't really count and aren't real. So the core of Trump is narrowing the idea of American citizenship down to a certain type of person, which is obviously racialized. Certain people are citizens, real citizens. Other people aren't really. I think that's at real core of it. Like, yeah, you were saying Paul Ryan looked at the Tea Party and said, oh, it's about cutting Medicare and so on and so forth. He said, no, they don't like Obama. They don't think Obama's really an American. That's it. He got that immediately. He says he's not really American. That's what he was saying. What he's constantly saying is these people aren't really Americans. So there's that. The other thing that ripens, and I think, is that deindustrialization took place. There's a lot of insecurity. People don't have the sense of the same kinds of jobs, middle-class jobs that they could hope for. They see rural communities especially really collapsing and falling apart. Look, it sounds like very big melodramatic rhetoric to talk about the death of the West or something like that. But, my God, if you look at a lot of the country, they're ruins. But it was a once great civilization, and there are parts of this country that look ruined.
This is a way that Buchanan is too much of an egghead.
Yeah.
The West is an eggheady way to think about this.
And Trump says it, he says crippled America, and he says it, right, those are very abstract concepts. And he says, your life sucks. Look at where you live. It looks horrible. He just says it. He says, and we're going to fix things. I think that that's really underrated, is that people on the right say, oh, urban areas are so horrible and people are afraid to go out on the street, whatever. But if you go into a lot of rural, ex-urban areas, there's a, I would argue, like kind of an ongoing depression, which is missed by economic statistics. And I think that is a huge part of the sense of dissatisfaction that he gets into.
I do think it's worth noting here that it's not true that everybody voting for Donald Trump is left out of the economy. In 2020, he won voters with family incomes of $100,000 or more. And there are a lot of really, really rich people voting for Donald Trump. It is also true that many of the people who vote for him are feeling left out of the economy. They're certainly feeling left out of this intersection of the economy and the culture. One way I think income doesn't capture everything here is, look, you don't have a lot of poor graduate students voting for Donald Trump, and you do have a lot of people who, say, run local car dealerships. But the people running local car dealerships in smaller cities have a very different relationship to mass culture than the poor graduate students. They do feel like they're being left out of something. And so then if you go back, you do have David Duke making this argument that the culture is losing itself as a white Christian nation, that if you are now a sort of traditionalist white Christian, that you are fundamentally on the outs.
Buchanan picks up on that.
Right.
And says, we are the majority, the forgotten man, the silent majority.
Yeah.
And they are betraying our values. Right. They are accepting of homosexuality and pornography and licentiousness and, whatever it might be. Trump actually then just picks up on the fact that this world, evangelical Christians in particular, now don't feel like the silent majority.
Right.
They feel like the embattled minority.
Yeah.
Like, I can't even not bake a cake for a gay wedding kind of thing.
Yeah.
And he doesn't present himself exactly as one of them. He presents himself as the son of a bitch they need, defending them.
Oh, absolutely.
And that both, I think, reflects a kind of intuition on his part, but also a genuine change, not in the social character of Trumpism, but of the nation. Like, we are a secularizing nation.
Mm-hmm.
We are a nation where there are differing power structures. We are a nation where what is okay in 2020 or 2016 is very different than what was okay in 1990 or 1980.
Yeah.
I always think this is actually very, very, very underplayed.
Yeah.
Is the importance of the sense of Christian religious embattlement in the Trump phenomenon.
Yeah, I think the evangelical Christian voters and what some people identify themselves as and are becoming more and more identified as Christian nationalists, they're kind of one constituency that has, I think, a pretty clear instrumental attitude towards Trump in certain ways. You know, they know that he can get through certain conservative policy programs, and they've been, rewarded for staying loyal to him. So I think that in some ways they have a very instrumental idea of Trump. Again, goes back to the kind of gangsterism of it, being like, we need a gangster.
Although I do think this is something that has changed a bit. I mean, this has been very broadly reported on.
Right.
But in 2016, the relationship was instrumental.
Yeah.
He said he would put our judges on the court.
Yes.
And 2024, it's no longer instrumental, right?
No.
At least not among evangelical Christians as a kind of community. It's become a deep, like, he is chosen by God as our defender sort of thing.
No, that is absolutely
like
true.
Something changed there very dramatically.
Yes, there is obviously a lot of people who have a messianic conception of him. And I think that that's what his politics are plugging into is something mythical, is a sense of American decline, American catastrophe that can be reversed through his power. And a lot of people who had versions of that are becoming seduced to his message and that he's the deliverer of that. And that's the strength of his politics.
One of the things that has been an interesting shift during the Trump years is it's almost a little bit jarring. Big business was supposed to be a Republican constituency, right? There was still a big sense of material division in American politics, and Democrats were allied with the environmental groups and the racial equity groups, and Republicans had the corporations.
Yeah.
And over the past 6-8-ish years, that's shifted. And even the people coming up behind Trump, your Vivek Ramaswamy's, your Ron DeSantis's, they're making a lot of their target the corporations, right?
Sure.
DeSantis versus Disney. This sense of the basic insight of the populist right becoming increasingly the organizing insight of the Republican Party.
Sure.
How do you think about that ideological shift?
I think that that's very interesting, important, and subtle and hard to tease out sometimes, but I think we could start to do it. So I think that there's an attack on corporate America, so-called woke capital. I do think, though, ultimately the Republicans are never really that unfriendly to business, no matter what they say. And there's been some indications from comments of people on Wall Street that said, because of what happened last time, Trump wins, Trump doesn't win. It's not such a big deal. We can really work with this guy. And the Trump administration in actual practice was very good for business interests, not only just tax cuts, but there was some study done that, like, if you had a direct business connection with Trump, like your company saw a marked increase in profits after his election. From our perspective, it's corrupt. But for a lot of other people, it's what he's meant to do. He's meant to get the economy going in a certain way, which is not, stimulus and so on. So it's connecting the right people. It's making deals happen. And that's a conception of the economy that is a network of family firms and relationships, not big abstract concepts. Yeah.
Well, this gets to a very core part of Donald Trump's more banal appeal to people, which is, look, David Duke, Pat Buchanan, what the hell do they know about the economy?
Right.
I think the thing liberals do where they try to pretend Donald Trump had no business acumen.
Yeah.
And like, well, if you just invested the money he got when he was young in the S&P 500, he also would.
Yeah.
Trump turned money into branding and power and cultural centrality.
Yeah.
He represented for years in America what success literally meant.
He was the big money guy.
He was a big money guy. He had The Apprentice. He had Celebrity Apprentice. But he also has these buildings. I mean, you can walk around New York today and like look at these gigantic buildings with his name on them. He built real things in the real world. And then because until 2020, when the pandemic hit, I would say Trump was largely drafting off of the Obama recovery, and then Republicans were happy to spend as much as he wanted. So in addition to the Obama recovery, Republicans stopped cutting spending and just added stimulus into the economy. The economy is pretty good. Yeah. It's actually better now than it was then, but it was pretty good. And so between both like the memory of a pretty good economy before the sort of inflation and interest rate hit post-pandemic, and the fact that Trump is still good at performing, still maintains that sense in people that he is maybe this great businessman, that he is somebody who is in some ways connected to like the fundamental currents of economic success.
Yes.
There are a lot of people who don't like his more outrageous comments, his more horrifying comments, who don't like January 6th.
Right.
But they just don't care that much.
No.
Their relationship to politics is more arm's length and transactional.
Yeah.
And they're like, yeah, Trump, that guy's good at running economies.
I think that's all absolutely correct. I mean, he was the symbol of a rich guy for so long. He was what people knew as a rich guy. I think this is kind of telling is that I have this memory of being a child. And when I was a child, you know, I didn't really understand any of this stuff. Donald Trump was in the news a lot. And he was the rich guy, right? And it was Donald Trump. And then I heard he went bankrupt. And in my child's mind, I was sad that Donald Trump went bankrupt because I was like, but he's the rich guy. Like, it felt like something had been lost in culture or something. Like, I was like, but that symbol is no longer there now. Like, I don't know where to orient my child mind about it. And, you know, I think that resonates with a lot of people on a deep level. They're like, yeah, he's the rich guy and I want him to be successful. And if he's successful, I'll be successful. I'm in proximity to it. It'll touch me. You know, that'll happen. That's maybe thinking a little too little of people, but I think there's some people out there who think this way.
I do think here you get this difference between sort of the liberal conception of how you want to run an economy, which is rightly or wrongly, like, let's put a bunch of technocratic experts in charge of things. And this sort of populist conception, which is you need to break through to the part where the treasure is kept. And you need a person, I mean, this was always Trump's appeal, something he said very explicitly, like, he has this line I love from 2016 where he says, I've been greedy my whole life, and now I'm going to be greedy for you.
Right.
And there is a sense of him as a guy who knows how to work the back rooms. And if you believe the whole thing is corrupt, then what you need is a guy who understands the corruption working on your behalf.
Yes, absolutely.
And then he does this very explicitly. So I want to play a clip from Trump that gets at sort of two dimensions of this simultaneously, because it both includes one of the really terrible things he said recently that got a lot of liberal outrage attached to it, and then also gets at, I think, him making this argument from a recent rally.
If you're listening, President Xi, and you and I are friends, but he understands the way I deal, those big monster car manufacturing plants that you're building in Mexico right now, and you think you're going to get that, you're going to not hire Americans, and you're going to sell the cars to us. No, we're going to put a 100% tariff on every single car that comes across the line, and you're not going to be able to sell those cars. If I get elected, now if I don't get elected, it's going to be a bloodbath for the whole, that's going to be the least of it. It's going to be a bloodbath for the country. That'll be the least of it. But they're not going to sell those cars. They're building massive.
I think that clip is really interesting. So on the one hand, people probably heard about Trump saying, if I'm not elected, it's going to be a bloodbath.
Yeah.
And I think in context, I feel like he is, if you're being fair, he's saying this sort of as a very weird way to make a point about how badly America is going to be broadly ripped off.
Right.
And there is this way in which he gets pulled out of context, and then that looks to his supporters like the media is against him.
Right.
And on the other hand, that is a crazy way to describe that.
Yeah.
But there's also this other thing he's saying, like, I'm friends with President Xi. He knows how I deal. Like, I'm going to be the son of a bitch on your side.
Right.
Like, cut in the good deals for you, being the sort of gangster negotiator on your behalf. And like, that's a message he's like pinging at his people right there. And there is power to it.
Absolutely. I think that's a key to the conception of business that his supporters have, and it's not a stupid conception of business. It's true. I mean, business is a lot of relationships, and Trump has instrumentalized them. He thinks he's better than he probably is, but there is a correct populist assumption, which they look at elites and they say, well, these people are all friends, and I'm not part of that group of friends. Why do people get involved in politics, right? When let's say you're on the make as a businessman, a small businessman. Well, you get involved in politics, you meet a lot of other people who can help you out. These things are just true in parts of the American system. In the highest rhetoric, they don't often get spoken to, and I think that appeals to people too. He's just talking about how the sausage is made. Sometimes it's too crude. Sometimes it's a stupid way of looking at things. Things are more complicated. But he's willing to tell people the truth from their perception about how things are actually done.
And then there's the other side of the bloodbath comment, which is whatever he meant it as in that paragraph. Yeah. This is a guy who presided over, encouraged like a January 6th insurrection that almost, like literally did have blood, but almost became a true murderous bloodbath in the halls of Congress. Well, and he's opening rallies with the people who participated in that insurgency singing the Star-Spangled Banner.
Well, yeah.
And there is this question always, I think, and this goes back to this slipperiness of how to take him. You have a quote I really like about January 6th, and you write, "From a certain perspective, the critics who say that talking about fascism takes Trump too seriously are correct. It involves too much hocus pocus, it cloaks him in a certain dark grandeur, and it gives everything a Spenglerian gloom that makes him seem bigger than he is. After all, he's just a crook and a con man, an idiot. But the phoniness, the bombast, and the ridiculousness was a part of the original thing too. There's always been a deeply moronic side to fascism. Fascism is perhaps most fundamentally a moron putting on world historical airs. Morons trying to make history. What better way to describe January 6th? The second biggest mistake is to take it too seriously. But the first biggest mistake is to not take it seriously enough." But you don't really say then in that piece, where does that leave you? Like, how do you take it?
It's difficult. I think you constantly have to adjust your judgment of it. Look, the song with the January 6th people, I mean, this turning the fallen of the previous attempts into martyrs, after the February 6th, 1934 riots at the French Parliament, which is one of my favorite comparisons to January 6th, there was a concerted effort by the French right to turn the fallen into martyrs and to say this was a moment in which our movement was sort of baptized by fire. There's definitely an attempt to raise the people who were at January 6th into martyrs. I mean, that's very difficult to argue with, I think. But in terms of that question, I would say this. I think that the record of thinking of Trump as a fascist or a would-be fascist has a better predictive power than saying that he's not. So everyone said, this guy, he's such an idiot. He's so weak. He doesn't really have the political skills, and he definitely doesn't have the organization. He doesn't have an SS or an SA or the black shirts behind him, really. He's got these kind of idiot militias that are totally disorganized. Okay, true. But the people said, well, what would a fascist dictator do? They would try to use their militias to make some kind of extra legal attack on power and try and stay in office, right? Well, he did that. So I would say that the theory of Trump, of treating Trump as if there was something seriously constant with the history of fascism, just has a better record as a theory of Trump. I mean, it's obviously not perfect. It's obviously not a perfect analogy.
I actually want to put the literal question of fascism to the side for a second, because I think people get like really caught up on very specific historical questions there, which is actually an argument you've made, I think, quite well. But the point that treating Trump as genuinely dangerous has a record. And something you said gets at one of my really core concerns right now. Two things. One is that this point that the fact that he sometimes seems a little buffoonish is actually important to understanding not why it can't happen, but why it can. Yeah. Because the buffoonishness of these guys going all the way back, right? Mussolini, Hitler, anybody, right? And I don't always love the comparisons, particularly as a Jewish person. I think Hitler is a specific comparison. Yeah. But a lot of the people who have deeply endangered political systems or taken them over in a violent way, one way they got there was people underestimated them for a long time. And the way they got underestimated was they seemed a little bit ridiculous. But the second thing there, as you were just saying, one of the critiques made of why it couldn't go that far with Trump last time was that he didn't have a strong organization. Right. He could barely run his own administration. Yeah. That's not where he is now.
Well, I still don't think that he has I think there are more people who are willing to do his bidding and would be part of a, Trump administration, be more effective. He doesn't have vast armies of uniformed men at his disposal to intimidate voters and that sort of thing still. But yeah, he's a little bit more organized than Canny. In terms of his danger, absurdity level, I think another thing, even for his supporters, for everybody, I think this is a way that Trump works on everybody. There was an article a while back about why Hasidic Jews like Trump. And they use the Yiddish term heimish, which is like homey, cozy, right? There's something familiar about Trump, and this also goes back to his like New York accent and stuff like that and his gangsterism, that kind of puts you at ease because you're like, it's familiar. I know this kind of guy. They're not that dangerous. They're just kind of
It's Pat.
Yeah, it's Pat. You know, like, all right, he's a little bit outrageous, you know, but, you know, it's not that alien or scary because he's just like a guy I know from TV. I know guys like this. I know guys that talk like this. It's going to be strange to see this. He can kind of like drop the menacing seem a little cute sometimes, you know, and look kind of and hug people and seem lovable. And, you know, he has the ability, I think, to put on the charm and drop people's defenses. And I think that that's what people are responding to a lot is that, hey, he's just kind of a schmuck. And like, we know a lot of schmucks.
But I think this argument for why Trump was underestimated worked better before January 6th and after. If the question in 2016 was for a lot of liberals, like, how can people like this guy? He's saying the most awful things. He seems like this like cruel buffoon in many ways. Like he's even saying terrible things about Republicans. The question in 2024 for a lot of them is, you've all seen what he's capable of. You saw January 6th. You saw that mob at the Capitol. You see the criminal cases against him right now. Like you saw him actually try to intimidate people to overturn the election, not just, you know, with a mob, but also calling state election officials. And yet, if you look at polling, Trump is polling better than he ever has in terms of his matchups with the Democrat, right? There's never a period in any previous election where Trump led, and he's not been behind for very long in this one, and he's leading now. And so there is this thing that I think people thought, well, if people just see what he's capable of, they just know that we're right about him. And it didn't work at all.
No.
But I'm curious how you read that.
A lot of people just don't really understand that stuff and don't give a shit.
Well, what do you mean I don't understand it? Because it's not like you need a lot of, like, you don't need a post-grad degree to understand a mob at the Capitol.
I don't know. I think that the amount of people who are aware of what happened is probably smaller than you think it is. The amount of people who conceptualize it in the way that we do, that it was a sincere attempt to overthrow democracy in America, is not as big as we think it is. The amount of people who view it as something positive and what they wanted is probably not huge either. But I think there are a lot of people who just don't have a strong view or clear understanding of what happened at all and don't care. You see this in history a lot, where there's moments at which these would-be dictators get to a point where it looks like their coalition's about to collapse. They do something outrageous. They do something really bad. Mussolini did this when he had an opponent killed. And the conservatives who backed him were like, this is starting to look like it's not the kind of thing we want to do. And they even say, and it looks like he's about to collapse. And then somehow they politically navigate this situation. The conservatives say, well, we can still get some things out of him. Now he's vulnerable. He needs us even more. And now we got him. So we'll continue to provide support because this actually leaves an opening for us. Right after January 6th, you're like, oh, the Republicans are going to finally had enough. No. He's been able to navigate and get over those waves and breakers several times. He's lucky, but he has a certain amount of skill. And he also has he still has a constituency behind him, which they can't ignore at their peril, you know? Sometimes their literal peril. I don't know how he becomes dictator, but he definitely wants to. That's not up for debate. That shouldn't be up for debate.
So when you then think about the history of how sort of these populist right figures do end up diminished, right? I mean, some of them just get defeated, right? Buchanan just doesn't win. Duke doesn't win. But in other countries, they do win. Sometimes in other countries, they do take over. When you look at history, what do you think this nets out to? I mean, is it just either they don't win the first time or they get defeated in a war? Like, what is your read of the history here?
Sometimes, they get defeated. They take over a country and then they get defeated in the war. Or, usually sometimes they take power for a little while. They get into some kind of crisis and their regime collapses because it doesn't have enough support. And sometimes they just fizzle out. I think it's important to remember, I think fascist propaganda about the 30s and so it's like, it makes these movements look inevitable, like the force of history, right? Like they're just moving and it was impossible for them to stop and they had so much power behind them. And that gives us a kind of cartoonish picture of them. In point of fact, there were many contingent points along the line where things could have gone otherwise. And their political support could have collapsed all of a sudden, and they got lucky. Just as easily as things taking power is, fortune goes the other way. And he doesn't get the right equation. He doesn't get the backing of the people he needs. He doesn't form the coalition he needs. It might go back into the reservoir, to use your metaphor, but it just fizzles in a certain way.
And what about the reservoir itself? I mean, one of the things that I find curious about Trump is the way he has infected the broader Republican Party, particularly now that he's been back on the scene. I mean, different people are trying to learn something from him on the right. And I do think it creates this question of how do you reduce the demand for something like him, which I'm not sure is the same question as how you beat him.
My obvious instinct to this as a kind of social democrat, New Deal Democrat kind of guy is that we need to, I know the economy appears to be doing well. I strongly believe that there are structural issues that need to be answered about how Americans leave behind a better life for their children, how jobs feel more secure, how the country feels productive and heading in a certain direction. Our country has a story behind it and leadership that feels like it's taking it that way. I think that's a big part of it. I hope. I do believe in the United States especially, everyone who's tried to become a mini Trump hasn't really been able to do it. DeSantis' campaign fizzled. Ramaswamy didn't really go anywhere. I think, honestly, and I hate to say this because it's something he would say, he's a pretty special guy. And he
more and more people are saying that.
More people saying it. I think, as I was saying, he's a synthesis. He is uniquely positioned to synthesize all of these different aspects and come together as the kind of perfect candidate for these types of politics. It makes sense. Oh, you're like, oh yeah, TV guy, business guy, big racist. Yeah, it kind of all adds up. And so much of this politics is a cult of personality and about the charisma of the individual who represents all of these things. The leader really matters in these types of politics. So I think that the loss of this leadership, be it through looking like a loser 2 times, ending up in jail, I think it would be pretty devastating. I think it would be a big setback for right-wing populism to lose Trump, for sure.
And then always our final question. What are 3 books you would recommend to the audience?
Okay. So my first book is kind of big and long, but it's one of my favorite books about American history. It's called What Hath God Wrought? The Transformation of America, 1815 to 1848. History of America in the Jacksonian times. It's a wonderful history, but I just think it's so interesting to see how the country, although it was so different back then, there are so many things that feel familiar, so many culture wars, so many political issues, so many different divisions between different geographic parts of the country that really still have some kind of resonance with today. And I just think it's a wonderful book and everybody should read it. Now, if you don't want to read a 900-page book, I can offer something much shorter, which is a book called After Nationalism, Being American in an Age of Division by Samuel Goldman. It's just a wonderful book on what it means to be American today and how we've lost and still have some of the myths and themes of American history. And the third book I would recommend is The Politics of Cultural Despair by Fritz Stern, where he talks about the kinds of people in Germany who prior in the 19th century kind of created the ideological underpinnings for what became Nazism. And it's a wonderful book.
John Gans, thank you very much.
Thank you.
This episode of The Ezra Klein Show was produced by Annie Galvin. Fact-checking by Michelle Harris. Our senior engineer is Jeff Geld with additional mixing from Efim Shapiro. Our senior editor is Claire Gordon. The show's production team also includes Roland Hu and Kristen Lin. We have original music by Isaac Jones. We have audience strategy by Christina Samaluski and Shannon Busta. The executive producer of New York Times Opinion Audio is Annie Rose Strasser, and special thanks to Sonia Herrero.